Hi, folks. Well, it always amuses me when people talk about INFJs having terrible memories, because I don't think that's true. I think that the main reason is I just don't think that's true. Part of the issue is that we tend, and this is something that happens in everyday life often, we distort the truth of something by taking too literally a particular sentence. So, when someone says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I have a terrible memory," we assume that means that person's memory is in fact terrible, whereas it just usually means that they forgot your birthday or particular details, or they didn't remember someone's face. But in order to be a functioning human being, you need 98% of your memory capacity to be impeccable. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to function if you're going to be in an institution or wherever you're going to be. So the first thing to mention is that most everyday functioning people's memory is just fine. But it's true that some people have strong memories of details, and people have better memories of specific patterns, particular themes, or sometimes they do remember facts, but they don't understand why they retain certain facts and events very, very vividly. And others just didn't seem to, happen for them. It just blanked them. And this is very often the case with NI users, strong NI users included, whereas the more democratic approach to retaining lots of different facts without particular discrimination between those facts that are very relevant and those that are less vivid and just disappear, it's less present. There's more an all-encompassing acceptance, right? But to say that this is a distinction between a good memory and a bad memory is not really operational. Maybe a better approach would be to say that one memory is kind of generally good, the other one is very selective. But a selective memory can be excellent, just selective. And it has more to do not so much with the proficiency of the memory, the quality of the memory capacity, but with the type of focus you place on the particular fact. We all know that concentration focus is extremely important in determining whether you're going to retain a piece of information. If you don't focus on it, if you're not interested in it, you won't retain it, not because your memory is bad, but because you didn't put enough of a laser-like focus on it. Whereas, if you're democratic in your focus, you're most likely to remember most things. Maybe like the level of vividness won't be as intense for particular facts and events, but you'll remember more things, quantitatively perhaps. But it's just different approaches to memory. And if you think about it for a second, it's just like FI and NE for INFJs, is that the problem with wanting to say that INFJs use FI and INFJs use NE is that from the moment that you are ready to say they use those functions, you have to say, until proven otherwise, you have to say that those functions are below the four main functions in the stack, so they're basically unconscious functions. And to the extent that they're unconscious functions, they're going to be fairly wild, savage, not savage, but archaic and dysfunctional, like the shadow complexes are in Jung, and I think that's simply the case. So it's like it's wanting to say, okay, I know surely INFJs ought to be able to use FI, but from the moment that you allow them to use FI, in fact, they're completely dominated by an archaic version of FI that is dysfunctional. And it's the same with NE, and the explanatory framework is just not very satisfactory. It's even worse with SI, because SI is supposed to be even lower in the stack. So it's saying, yeah, INFJs use SI, but really they don't, because SI is so wild and so uncontrollable that they can do nothing with it. So it's much better to try to see if the function of recall in this case is probably introverted perception anyway. So you're looking at introverted intuition doing the work that you thought SI did. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Introverted intuition in Jung and in other authors is very, very connected to the idea of time passing, of like the passing of time, the projecting across time. If you're projected across time via introverted intuition, you're not going to be just in the present, and you're not going to be just in the future. You're going to be in the present through a projection of the past into the future. This is what we see all the time in prominent INFJs. They tend to be future-oriented, but with a desire to have this strongly future-oriented vision informed by tradition. So you almost never see, unlike ENTPs and the NFPs, you and other extroverts, You're very, including INFJs, you will rarely ever see an INFJ who's just into future stuff just for the sake of future stuff and says no to whatever was past. They always want to retain the past or elements of the past that they think is relevant to their vision and project it into the future. It just makes their vision more discriminatory. It's the tunnel-like, vision of NI that we've become familiar with. That's what determines the focus you're going to put on the facts and information that you gather in the external world, and therefore going to determine whether you retain it or not. You're an INFJ, just like an INTJ and perhaps other types as well. They will retain very vividly those facts and patterns and themes and thoughts that already align with the particular direction that their worldview is going. And the other things, the more distant they are from that core holistic worldview, the less likely they are to be retained. But because the other facts are retained, the other things that are retained are close to the vision, they're also extremely vivid because they correspond to what's already been defined inside the mind frame. So if you like, it's not democratic, but what's retained, aristocratically you might say, is retained very vividly because it is so close to the DNA of the INFJ mind, INTJ mind. And that's how you can explain the memory of INFJs without resorting to SI, but resorting to NI. Remembering that ultimately, whether you have a good memory or not in the pure memory capacity is something that has to do with your brain. It's not really something that has to do with your cognitive functions. Cognitive functions always has to do with a kind of connection between your pure physical brain capacity and how this is articulated in thought. And this is the function of introvert intuition. It's also the function of introvert sensation for SI users. And just the memory then and the function of recall comes across very differently. But it's not quite true that one has a terrible memory and the other doesn't. You have a terrible memory if the implicit baseline is democratic and wide memory of facts. If your focus is more on quality, like vivid, very vivid, laser-like focus on certain facts, it's the INFJ that has the better memory. So it depends how you look at it. And again, if you're hesitating about this, and particularly about SI, ask yourself, who between an INFJ and an ENTP on average has better memory? You probably want to say INFJ. And yet, if you embrace the 8-function model, you're forced to admit that INFJ has lower SI than ENTP. It doesn't work. So you have to use NI instead. Don't forget that I have written a book on the INFJ recently, The Infinite Soul, INFJ Life in the Modern World, a book that explores how INFJs can find meaning, purpose, and rich lives in the world today. It's a sequel to the Ecstatic Soul, which you might be familiar with, an exploration of the INFJ psyche. Prequel and sequel, Man and Woman, isn't that beautiful? 2 beautiful books. Get those 2 books if you haven't yet. And I have a Patreon page that you can support down below. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow.